A small blonde girl in an oversized gray hoodie burst into the rain-slicked alley behind the iron foundry, her frantic footsteps splashing through puddles and shattering the heavy silence of the Underworld meeting. "Please, is this enough?" she cried, her voice trembling as she clutched a crumpled, wet piece of paper against her chest. "Is this enough to buy my freedom?" Every man in the shadows froze. The freezing rain seemed to hang motionless in the yellow glow of the flickering streetlight. 6 pairs of cold, predatory eyes turned toward the child. These were the Red Wolves, men in thick coats with prison tattoos creeping up their necks, men who commanded fear with a single glance. Mikhail Volkov, the Pakhan of the Bratva, stood at the center. A hardened, middle-aged man in a black leather jacket, his sharp features were illuminated by the dim light as he studied the fragile innocents standing before him. No one moved. No one spoke. "My name is Anya," she whispered, tears mixing with the rain on her face. "My stepfather. He lost the card game. He said I have to go with the man in the suit. Please." One of Mikhail's lieutenants stepped forward, hand reaching inside his coat, but Mikhail raised a single gloved hand, a silent command to halt. He moved slowly, crouching down to Anya's eye level. "Let me see the paper, Malishka," Mikhail said, his voice a low rumble, controlled and dangerous. "Who is coming for you?" "Sergei," she sobbed, thrusting the damp note toward him. "And Councilman Kovac. He's right behind me." Mikhail took the paper, his jaw tightening as he read the scribbled gambling debt. "Anya Petrovna. Collateral. A photograph, a signature, and a price." His dark eyes flickered with a lethal, icy rage. That's when they heard it. The heavy, confident footsteps echoing at the alley's entrance. Mikhail stood up to his full height, the crumpled note still in his hand. He didn't look back at the entrance. He kept his eyes on Anya. "This isn't a receipt, child," he said softly, stepping between her and the approaching shadows. "It's a death warrant." He turned to face the entrance as his men moved in perfect synchronization to form a wall. The hunters had just walked into the wolf's den. Mikhail's leather glove creaked as his fist tightened around the damp paper. The ink was bleeding, blurring the jagged signature of a desperate man, but the terms were sickeningly clear. $50,000. Payable immediately. Failure to pay resulted in the forfeiture of the asset listed below. Anya Petrovna, age 7. It was a contract of sale disguised as a promissory note, written by a coward and enforced by a monster. He looked down at Anya. She wasn't looking at him anymore. Her blue eyes were fixed on the alley entrance, wide with the kind of terror that makes prey freeze rather than run. The rain plastered her blonde hair to her forehead, making her look even smaller against the backdrop of industrial brick and iron. "There she is," a voice rasped, wet and breathless. 2 figures emerged from the curtain of rain. The first was Sergei, a man Mikhail recognized from the lower-tier gambling dens, a creature of twitchy nerves and cheap vodka. He looked disheveled, his eyes darting frantically between the shadows, unable to focus on the predators standing in them. Behind him stood Councilman Dmitry Kovac, holding a black umbrella that seemed to shield him not just from the rain, but from the grime of the world he was exploiting. Kovac wore a cashmere coat that cost more than Sergei's life was worth, and his face bore the bored expression of a man running a mundane errand. "Anya," Sergei barked, his voice cracking with false bravado. "Get over here right now. You stupid girl, running off like that. Mr. Kovac is waiting." Anya didn't move. She pressed her back against Mikhail's leg, hiding behind the heavy leather of his coat. The contact was slight, but to Mikhail, it felt like a lightning strike. It had been years since anyone had looked at him for protection rather than mercy. "I don't have all night, Sergei," Kovac said, checking a gold watch on his wrist. "My driver is waiting. Hand her over so we can consider your debt settled." Sergei lunged forward, reaching for the girl's hood with a desperate, shaking hand. "I said come here." He never made contact. Mikhail didn't have to speak. He simply shifted his weight. In an instant, the 6 men behind him, the Red Wolves, stepped out of the darkness. They moved with the synchronized precision of a locking mechanism. The metallic click of a slide racking back echoed louder than the thunder overhead. Sergei froze, his hands suspended in midair. He looked up, finally realizing who was standing in the dark. He wasn't looking at common street thugs. He was staring into the dead, unblinking eyes of the Bratva. Mikhail stepped forward, placing himself fully between the girl and the two men. He held up the crumbling wet note, letting the rain batter it one last time. "You seem confused, Sergei," Mikhail said, his voice dropping to a register that vibrated in the chest. "You think you came here to collect a package, but you really came here to answer for a sin." Before Mikhail's judgment could be delivered, the alley exploded in a strobe of red and blue light. Sirens wailed, cutting through the rain and bouncing off the brick walls, a deafening cacophony that shattered the standoff. "Police, drop the weapons. Hands where I can see them." Two patrol cars screeched to a halt at the alley's mouth, blocking the exit. Four officers spilled out, service weapons drawn and leveled at Mikhail's chest. The Red Wolves didn't flinch, their hands hovering near their coats, waiting for a command that would turn the alley into a slaughterhouse. Mikhail didn't raise his hands. He didn't look at the officers. He looked at Kovac. The councilman's shock dissolved instantly, replaced by a practiced, serpentine calm. He stepped past the trembling Sergei, reaching into his cashmere coat not for a weapon, but for a leather wallet. He flipped it open, the gold badge of the city council gleaming under the harsh police lights. "Officer," Kovac shouted, his voice projecting the authority of a man who signed the department's budget checks. "Thank God you're here. I am Councilman Dmitry Kovac. These men are attempting to abduct this child." The lead officer lowered his gun slightly, squinting through the rain. Recognition dawned on his face, followed immediately by deference. "Councilman, we got a call about a disturbance." "A kidnapping," Kovac corrected smoothly, gesturing to Sergei. "This is the girl's father. We came to retrieve her, and these gangsters threatened our lives." "That's a lie," Anya screamed, her small voice cracking. "He sold me. Look at the paper." The officer's eyes flicked to Mikhail, then to the girl, and finally settled on the weeping, pathetic figure of Sergei. The law was a binary machine, and on paper, Sergei was the parent and Kovac was the pillar of the community. Mikhail was just the tattooed thug in the dark. "Sir," the officer barked at Mikhail, stepping forward. "Step away from the minor." Now, Mikhail felt the heat of violence coiling in his gut. He could end this. His men could drop the cops before they radioed for backup. But a firefight with the police would bring the entire city down on the Bratva, and Anya would likely catch a stray bullet in the chaos. He looked down at Anya. She was clinging to his jeans, shaking so hard it vibrated through his leg. "They will hurt her," Mikhail said, his voice deadly calm. "That's for the courts to decide," the officer snapped. "Release the girl, or you're under arrest." Kovac smirked, a subtle, venomous curling of his lip. He knew he had won. The system was built for men like him. Slowly, agonizingly, Mikhail reached down. He gently peeled Anya's freezing fingers from his jacket. "Go," he whispered. "Do not fight them yet." Sergei lunged forward, snatching Anya by the wrist and dragging her toward the councilman's waiting luxury sedan. As Kovac turned to follow, adjusting his expensive collar, Mikhail took one step forward, invading the politician's personal space. The officer shouted a warning, but Mikhail ignored it. He leaned in close, his breath ghosting against Kovac's ear. "You think the sun has risen because you see blue lights," Mikhail murmured, his voice low and absolute. "But you are wrong, Dmitry. The night is long." The heavy oak doors of the Vostok Club closed, shutting out the drone of the city, but trapping the lethal silence of the room within. The air smelled of stale cigar smoke and expensive cognac, a scent that usually signaled celebration, but tonight smelled like a funeral pyre. Mikhail stood at the head of the mahogany table, his leather jacket dripping rainwater onto the Persian rug. Around him sat the Vor, his inner circle. For men who controlled the docks, the unions, and the streets. They watched their pack on with wary intensity, waiting for the explosion that usually followed such a public insult. But Mikhail didn't explode. He was terrifyingly quiet. He poured a drink, the crystal decanter chinking softly against the glass. The amber liquid swirled as he stared into it, seeing not the alcohol, but the terrified blue eyes of a child being dragged away by the law. He used a badge to steal a child, Mikhail said, his voice barely rising above a whisper. He hid behind the law to break the oldest law of all. He took a milishka to pay a debt. We can take him tonight, Mikhail. Yuri, his chief enforcer, grunted from the corner. He was cleaning his fingernails with a switchblade. A bullet is cheap. Kovac disappears. The girl is free. No. Mikhail slammed the glass down. It didn't break, but the sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. A bullet is mercy. A bullet is too quick for a man who sells souls. Mikhail walked to the window, looking out at the glittering skyline where Councilman Kovac likely slept in high-rise comfort, believing his power protected him. Dmitry Kovac believes he is untouchable because he wears a suit, Mikhail continued, his back to the room. He believes the police shield him. But he has forgotten who truly owns this city's shadows. He turned back to the table, his eyes hard as flint. He is Bespredel. The words sucked the air out of the room. The men straightened in their chairs. Bespredel. Without limits. Lawlessness. In the code of the Bratva, designating a man Bespredel stripped him of all status, all protection, and all humanity. It was a declaration that the rules of engagement no longer applied. It was a green light for total, unrestricted warfare. I want his accounts frozen, Mikhail commanded, the strategy forming with cold precision. I want his investors to receive dossiers of his darkest habits. I want every business in this city, from the five-star hotels to the corner bodegas, to know that serving Dmitry Kovac is an act of war against the Red Wolves. And the girl? Yuri asked softly. We find her, Mikhail said. But first, we strip him naked. I want him to lose his power, his money, and his name. I want him to scream for the police and find that no one is listening. Mikhail looked at his reflection in the dark window, seeing the monster he was about to unleash. Do not kill him yet, he whispered. Destroy his world first. The siege began not with a bang, but with the quiet, humiliating screech of metal on asphalt. Councilman Kovac stepped out of City Hall, adjusting his silk tie, expecting to see his black Bentley idling at the curb. Instead, he saw the rear bumper of his pride and joy hoisted into the air by a grimy tow truck. Hey, Kovac shouted, his polished demeanor cracking instantly. He ran down the steps, waving his briefcase. That is a government vehicle. Put it down immediately. The driver didn't look up. He was a massive man with a thick beard and knuckles tattooed with Cyrillic script. He simply revved the engine, choking Kovac in a cloud of diesel exhaust, and dragged the car into midday traffic. Kovac reached for his phone to call the police commissioner, but the screen remained black. No service. He stared at the bars in confusion. He was in the center of the city, yet he was electronically stranded. It got worse. Lunch was supposed to be a power play at Le Monarch, the city's most exclusive restaurant. Kovac ordered the lobster, ignoring the strange, heavy silence of the waitstaff. When the bill came, he tossed his platinum Amex onto the tray with practiced arrogance. The waiter returned 30 seconds later, holding the card between two fingers like it was a dead insect. Declined, sir. Impossible, Kovac hissed, snatching it back. Run it again. We tried 3 cards, councilman, the waiter said, his voice carrying across the silent dining room. The bank says your assets have been frozen. Fraud investigation. Heads turned. Whispers started, the sound of social vultures circling a dying carcass. Kovac stood up, knocking his chair over, and fled the restaurant, the humiliation burning his neck like a fever. He needed sanctuary. He hailed a taxi, paying with the last crumpled bills in his pocket, and directed it to a quiet apartment building in the West End. Elena would be there. She was his escape, the one person paid to listen to his problems. But when he unlocked the door, the apartment was stripped bare. Elena. She was standing by the window, a suitcase at her feet. On the coffee table lay a thick manila envelope, spilled open. Photographs of children. Financial ledgers. The dark, ugly truth of his consulting business. I didn't know, she whispered, her voice trembling. She looked at him not with adoration, but with revulsion. I thought you were just corrupt, Dmitri. I didn't know you were this. Elena, listen to me. Don't, she snapped, backing away. They told me what you did. They gave me a ticket to London and told me that if I stayed, I would burn with you. She walked out, the door clicking shut with the finality of a coffin lid. Kovac was alone. He stumbled out onto the street as the sun began to set, casting long, distorted shadows against the brickwork. He pulled his collar up, shivering. In the reflection of a shop window, he saw a figure standing across the street, a man in a dark coat, motionless, watching. Kovac blinked, and the figure was gone. He turned the corner and saw another. Then another. They were everywhere and nowhere, silent sentinels standing just at the edge of his vision. The city he thought he owned had turned into a cage, and the wolves were closing in. Sergei ran because he knew how to run. He ran from debts, he ran from fathers, and he ran from responsibilities. But he couldn't run from the silence. It followed him into the Krasny Lounge, a basement casino thick with cigar smoke and the smell of desperation. He needed money. A plane ticket to nowhere, a bribe for a border guard, anything to escape the eyes he felt watching him from every dark corner. He sat at the blackjack table, his hands trembling so violently he could barely hold his cards. He had pawned his watch, his wedding ring, even his shoes for a stack of chips. Hit me, he croaked. The dealer, a young man with a neutral face, slid a card. King of Hearts. 21. Sergei laughed, a wet, jagged sound. Again. He won the next hand. And the next. The stack of chips grew into a small fortress in front of him. For an hour, the laws of probability seemed to bend around him. The pit boss watched from the shadows, arms crossed, nodding slightly. Sergei didn't see the nod. He only saw the salvation piling up on the green felt. He was invincible. He could buy his way out. He could pay Kovac, pay the wolves, pay God himself. I'm doubling down, Sergei shouted, sweat dripping from his nose onto the table. Everything. All of it. The room went quiet. The ambient noise of slot machines and clinking glass seemed to fade away. The young dealer stepped back, and a new man took his place. This dealer was older. His skin was pale as parchment, and his eyes were void of any light. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't ask for bets. He simply shuffled the deck with a sound like dry bones snapping. Sergei shoved his tower of chips forward. Deal. 2 cards. Sergei peeked. 2 queens. 20. A winning hand. A fortune. Stand. Sergei breathed, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The dealer didn't check his down card. He simply flipped his hand over. Ace of spades. Jack of spades. Blackjack. Sergei stared at the cards. He blinked, trying to make them change, but the ink remained black and absolute. The dealer didn't reach for the chips. He just looked up. His gaze didn't stop at Sergei's face. It bored straight through his skull, dissecting the panic and the rot inside. It's a mistake, Sergei stammered. You cheated. The dealer remained silent. He slowly gathered the chips, the noise deafening in the hush. Give it back, Sergei screamed, lunging for the table. That's my life. I need that. 2 massive security guards materialized behind him, gripping his arms with bruising force. They didn't hit him. They didn't drag him out. They just held him there, forcing him to watch his salvation disappear into the dealer's tray. Sergei slumped, his legs giving out. He realized then that he hadn't been playing cards. He had been playing a part in a play written by Mikhail Volkov. They had let him climb the mountain just to push him off the edge. He began to weep, rocking back and forth on the casino floor, babbling about wolves and death warrants, while the dealer quietly shuffled the deck for the next victim. The war moved from the streets to the servers, fought in a windowless room beneath the Vostok Club where the air hummed with the cooling fans of a dozen hard drives. Mikhail stood behind Alexei, his lead technician, watching the digital autopsy of Dmitry Kovac's life. They had stripped the councilman of his wealth and his reputation, but Mikhail needed the root of the rot. He needed to know why a man with so much power was desperate enough to take a child as collateral. We found it, Alexei said, his voice flat. He didn't turn around. He just pointed to the center screen. The Hope Initiative. It's his primary charity. On paper, it funds foster care programs and youth shelters. On paper, Mikhail murmured. Show me the reality. Alexei typed a command, and the spreadsheet dissolved into a complex web of wire transfers. The donations come in from legitimate donors, galas, fundraisers, city grants. But the money doesn't go to the shelters. Within 24 hours of deposit, 80% is transferred to a holding company in the Caymans, then routed back into the city through a logistics firm called North Star Shipping. Mikhail leaned in. What does North Star ship? Nothing, Alexei said grimly. They don't have clients. They don't have inventory. They only have expenses. He pulled up a list of invoices. Industrial security doors, soundproofing materials, bulk orders of sedatives and medical supplies. And they own exactly one property. A satellite map popped up on the screen, grainy and gray. It showed a desolate stretch of the industrial waterfront, far from the commercial piers where the cranes operated day and night. At the end of a cracked asphalt road sat a rusted corrugated metal structure. Warehouse 41, Alexei read. It's officially listed as abandoned by the city. Kovacs signed the condemnation order himself 3 years ago. Mikhail stared at the building. It looked like a tomb. The pieces clicked together with terrifying clarity. The gambling debts, the desperation, the specific demand for Anya. Kovac wasn't just a corrupt politician skimming off the top. He was a merchant of flesh. The warehouse wasn't a storage facility. It was a holding pen. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Mikhail placed a hand on the back of Alexei's chair, his grip tightening until the leather creaked. He hides his monsters behind a charity for children, Mikhail said, the realization settling in his chest like a stone. There is a shipment scheduled for tonight, Alexei added, highlighting a final intercepted email. A boat is docking at midnight. Cargo to be loaded immediately. Mikhail straightened up, the time for digital warfare over. He buttoned his leather jacket, checking the weight of the Stechkin pistol in his shoulder holster. Get the men, Mikhail said, his voice void of any human warmth. We are done with silence. Subtlety died the moment Mikhail saw the satellite photos. There would be no negotiations, no shadows to hide in. Tonight, the Red Wolves hunted in the open. 3 black SUVs tore through the chain-link perimeter fence of the shipyard, metal screaming against metal. They didn't slow down until they screeched to a halt in a fan formation directly in front of Warehouse 41. Before the tires stopped spinning, the doors flew open. 12 men poured out. They moved with the terrifying, fluid synchronization of a single organism. 2 guards posted at the loading bay raised their rifles. But they were mercenaries fighting for a paycheck against men fighting for a code. Yuri dropped the first one with a single, silenced shot to the chest. The second guard turned to run, but Mikhail was already there. He pistol-whipped the man across the jaw, the sound of cracking bone sharp and sickening, sending him crumpling to the wet asphalt. Breach, Mikhail commanded. Yuri planted a shaped charge on the rolling steel door. Thump. The explosion was contained, a focused punch that blew the locking mechanism inward. The Bratva flowed into the warehouse. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of fear. High-intensity floodlights snapped on, blinding the 4 mercenaries scrambling for cover behind crates of machinery. Drop them, Mikhail roared, firing as he moved. The firefight was short and brutal. The acoustics of the metal cavern amplified every shot into a thunderclap. Mikhail didn't seek cover, he advanced. He was a force of nature, driven by a rage that had been cold for a decade and was now white-hot. He put 2 rounds into a gunman on the catwalk, watching him tumble over the railing. Within 60 seconds, silence returned to the warehouse, broken only by the smell of cordite and the groans of the wounded. Clear, Yuri shouted from the rear. Mikhail holstered his weapon and walked toward the center of the facility. There were no crates here. Instead, erected in the middle of the floor, was a large, windowless structure built from soundproof drywall. It looked like a walk-in freezer. Mikhail shot the padlock off the heavy steel door and kicked it open. The beam of his tactical light cut through the darkness inside. The air that rushed out smelled of stale food and unwashed bodies. Mikhail stepped in, his heart hammering against his ribs. Lined up against the walls were rows of camping cots. On them sat 6 terrified girls, none older than 12. They huddled together, shielding their eyes from the light, waiting for the next horror to begin. Mikhail lowered his light. He saw the chains bolted to the floor. He saw the empty food bowls. He saw the reality of Dmitry Kovac's charity. He fell to his knees, not in prayer, but in the crushing weight of relief and rage. He looked at the trembling children, and for the first time that night, the wolf's eyes softened. "It is over," he choked out in Russian, then in English. "The monsters are dead." The packet arrived on the desk of the FBI special agent in charge at 8 a.m. It contained no return address, just a simple emblem of a wolf stamped in red wax. Inside was a terabyte of digital poison, bank transfers, video surveillance from the warehouse, and a ledger detailing every soul Dmitry Kovac had sold. Mikhail had learned long ago that local corruption was like a weed. You couldn't trim it. You had to poison the soil. By bypassing the city police entirely and feeding the evidence directly to federal authorities and the national press, he ensured that no amount of bribes could stop the avalanche. By noon, the illusion of Kovac's power evaporated under the blinding glare of 100 camera flashes. He was attempting to leave City Hall, flanked by a phalanx of desperate lawyers, when the federal raid team swarmed the steps. These weren't the city police officers he invited to his galas. These were agents and Navy windbreakers who didn't care about his council seat or his connections. Dmitry Kovac. Federal agents. You are under arrest for human trafficking, racketeering, and conspiracy. The crowd of reporters surged forward, microphones thrust like spears. Kovac screamed, his face twisting into a mask of ugly, primal fear as the handcuffs clicked, a sound that cut through the noise of the city. "Do you know who I am?" Kovac shrieked, struggling as they hauled him toward the waiting SUV. "I run this city. This is a mistake." "Not anymore," an agent said, shoving Kovac's head down as he forced him into the vehicle. The door slammed shut, sealing his fate on live television. Across town, Sergei watched the arrest on a display TV in an electronics store window. He stood frozen on the sidewalk, a plastic bag of meager belongings in his hand. But he wasn't looking at Kovac on the screen. He was looking at the reflection in the glass. Behind him, across the street, stood a man in a dark coat. Just standing, smoking, watching. Sergei turned his head. On the other corner, another man. And by the bus stop, a third. They weren't moving. They weren't attacking. They were just there. Sergei's mind finally snapped. The pressure of the invisible siege, the days of paranoia, and the crushing weight of the silence broke him completely. He didn't run away. He ran toward the nearest police precinct. He burst through the double doors, hyperventilating, grabbing the desk sergeant by the lapels. "Arrest me!" Sergei shrieked, tears streaming down his face. "I confess. Everything. The gambling, the girl, the debt. Just lock me up. Sir, calm down. Put me in solitary." Sergei begged, collapsing to the floor, clawing at the linoleum. "Please. A cell with no windows. They're watching me. The wolves are everywhere." From a parked car down the street, Mikhail watched through tinted windows as Sergei was dragged away, not by the Bratva, but by his own terror. Justice had been served, and Mikhail hadn't fired a single bullet to do it. The autumn sun hit the crimson ivy of the university walls, a stark contrast to the freezing rain of that November night 10 years ago. Anya Petrovna stood on the podium, the weight of the valedictorian medal around her neck, looking out at a sea of proud parents and cheering students. She smiled, waving to the loving couple in the third row who had adopted her 2 weeks after the raid, a family chosen by invisible hands to ensure she never knew hunger or fear again. But as the applause washed over her, Anya's eyes drifted past the crowd, toward the back of the auditorium, to the darkened exit doors. There was no one there, of course. There never was. But she felt the presence all the same, a heavy, protective gravity that had orbited her life for a decade. It was in the scholarship that appeared when funding ran low, in the drunk driver who was intercepted blocks before hitting her car, in the silence that fell over the city whenever she walked alone at night. Later that evening, inside her quiet apartment, she found the package sitting on her desk. There was no postage stamp. The concierge simply said a courier had dropped it off, a man who spoke little and looked like he was carved from granite. Anya's fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from a breathless anticipation she had felt on every birthday and every milestone since she was 7. She carefully peeled back the heavy brown paper. Inside lay a book. It was a first edition of the Master and Margarita, leather-bound and smelling of history and expensive tobacco. It was the specific copy she had admired in a rare bookstore window 3 cities away during a summer internship. A fleeting desire she had never spoken aloud to anyone. There was no card, no congratulations, no signature. She opened the cover. Tucked inside was a heavy bookmark made of polished silver. At the top, embossed in the metal with exquisite detail, was a single emblem, the head of a wolf. Anya ran her thumb over the cold metal, a ghost of a memory surfacing, the smell of rain, leather, and the rumble of a voice that had once promised her the night was long. She walked to the window, looking down at the street below. A black sedan was idling at the corner, its engine purring soft smoke into the evening air. As she watched, the car slowly pulled away, disappearing into the city's veins. She pressed the book to her chest, watching the taillights fade until they were swallowed by the darkness. The world had told her that monsters lived in the shadows, waiting to devour little girls. But Anya knew the truth. Sometimes, the monster in the dark was the only thing keeping the nightmares at bay. She was never alone. The wolf was always watching. If this story stayed with you, let's stay connected. Hit subscribe.